A lantern burned low in the rafters, its flame trembling against the dark. Dust motes turned golden in the air, drifting slow as if the night itself held its breath. Jonah Calhoun pushed open the barn door and stepped inside, the hinges groaning like an old man's knees. He had come only to check on the horses, yet his eyes caught a shape curled in the hay. At first, he thought it a bundle of cloth, maybe something left behind by a hand that passed through. But then the bundle stirred, a faint gasp escaping. It was a woman. Her dress clung to her with the wear of miles, the color faded beyond memory of what it once had been. She lay half buried in straw, arms wrapped across her middle, as if she was guarding something precious. And indeed, beneath the tattered fabric, her belly rose round and heavy. The lantern's glow drew hollows in her cheeks, lines of exhaustion, lips whispering in her sleep to no one he could see. Jonah stopped in his tracks. He felt as though he had stumbled not upon a trespasser, but a wounded bird, fallen from storm. Jonah Calhoun was a man who lived without witness. 34 years old, hair dark with streaks of dust and sun, eyes that had seen too much death on battlefields and lonely roads. He kept to himself on this ranch at the edge of the prairie, letting silence do the speaking most men filled with liquor or brag. The townsfolk had given him names: Ghost Rancher, Calhoun the Shadow, for he rarely came to town save for coffee, tobacco, and horse feed. He bore it without protest, for he had lost his brother years back to an outlaw's bullet, and the echo of that grief had hollowed him. Since then, he'd learned to live among animals and wind instead of people. But here was someone who had carried her hurt straight into his barn. The woman's name, though he did not yet know it, was Clara Whitfield. She had once been a preacher's daughter, a voice trained in hymns that promised salvation. She had once worn bonnets crisp with starch, her steps steady behind a husband who swore he'd give her a home in the territories. That husband had died 2 months past on the trail west, fever taking him before he could lay a single fence post in the ground. Clara had buried him beneath a cottonwood with her own hands, then walked on, heavy with his child and heavier with the silence of being unwanted. When the town she passed through turned their backs, no bread, no roof, no warmth, she wandered farther, shame pressing her spine until she bent like a willow. She whispered apologies to the child inside her belly, as though the blame for her hunger and loneliness was hers to bear. Now, in Jonah's barn, she murmured in sleep, "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry," her voice breaking against the night like glass. Jonah moved closer, slow as if approaching a skittish colt. He crouched and touched her shoulder. Clara startled awake, eyes wide, terror making her small body draw up against the hay. She tried to rise, to flee, but her knees trembled beneath her weight. Jonah raised a hand, not to stop her, only to ease her fear. "Rest easy," he said, his voice deep but quiet, worn smooth like river rock. "Ain't no harm meant here." She stared at him, chest heaving, lips parted but no sound coming. He picked up the tin cup he'd left near the water barrel, filled it, and held it out. For a long moment, she did not move. Then, with hands shaking, she took it and drank. The silence between them was heavy, but it was not cruel. Jonah stood back and let her be, only adding, "Rest. Ain't no one gonna bother you here." Word in the town runs faster than wildfire. By morning, whispers curled through the general store. "Calhoun's got a woman hiding in his barn. Pregnant, too. Mark my words, she'll bleed him dry. No decent man takes in another man's child." Martha Gaines, wife of the storekeeper, clicked her tongue loud enough to carry. Jonah heard their talk while weighing out coffee beans. He said nothing at first, but when the muttering sharpened, he set down his sack, looked up, and answered steady, "Reckon what I do on my land ain't for sale in your mouth." He left it at that, eyes unflinching. Clara overheard a piece of that gossip later, when a woman spat near her boots as she passed. Shame returned like a knife twisting. She lowered her eyes and hurried on, each word of scorn stitching itself into her skin. But when she saw Jonah waiting with the wagon outside the store, silent, unmoving, as if daring anyone to stop her from climbing aboard, something inside her steadied. On the ranch, their lives bent toward each other in quiet ways. Jonah left fresh bread on a crate by the barn door. Clara found his shirt torn along the sleeve and mended it by lantern glow, her needle steady despite her swollen belly. Some nights, she hummed soft lullabies she remembered from childhood, and Jonah, standing at the threshold unseen, felt the sound loosen the rust around his heart. He had not heard a home sound like that in years. Clara began to see the man beyond his silence. How he knelt to stroke the muzzle of tired mare. How he set his coffee tin carefully aside, so as not to startle the sparrows nesting near the rafters. He was rough, yes, but gentleness lived in his hands when he thought no one watched. And Jonah began to see Clara's strength. Though shame clung to her shoulders, she carried her child with fierce tenderness, speaking to it as if it were already the dearest friend she had. One night, crickets sang in the black fields and the stars stretched wide as an endless sea. Clara stood outside the barn, hand resting on her belly, eyes turned upward. Jonah lingered nearby, drawn without knowing why. She spoke softly, as if confessing to the sky. Feels like the whole world's waiting to turn its back. Except you. Jonah looked at her then, his face shadowed by the starlight. He lowered his eyes, voice roughened with something he had held back for years. I've waited years for a woman like you. The words fell between them heavy, unpolished, stripped of poetry, yet carrying the ache of truth. Clara's breath caught. She did not answer, only stared at him, stunned by the weight of what he had given her. But for the first time since she had been left alone on the trail, she did not feel unwanted. She felt seen, and in that seeing, a seed of hope pressed roots into the hard earth of her heart. The prairie woke with a hush after dawn, the storm clouds of yesterday trailing far off like bruises on the horizon. Clara moved slower now, but she moved. She fed the hens with careful hands, scattering corn across the dirt while her belly strained against her faded dress. Jonah watched from the fence rail, pretending to check the nails, though in truth he was studying the way she carried herself, tired, yes, but with dignity creeping back into her bones. The ranch shifted with her presence. Where once silence pressed against Jonah like a weight, there now came the rhythm of chores done together. She stirred coffee on the stove while he cut wood. She laid bread to rise while he brushed down the horses. Nothing grand, no spoken promises, only the slow weaving of lives into a single cloth. But gossip does not sleep, not in a small town. Sheriff Amos Harlan rode out one afternoon, hat tilted low against the sun. His horse raised dust as he pulled up at the gate. Jonah leaned his forearm on the post, saying nothing. Jonah, the sheriff said, voice edged with discomfort, folks are restless. They don't take kindly to a woman of her circumstance staying out here with you. They'll start saying you've claimed what ain't yours. Clara had come to the doorway just in time to hear. Shame flooded her face, and that old voice inside whispered again, you don't belong. You don't deserve. By nightfall she had folded her few garments into a bundle. At the barn door she stood trembling, eyes wet. She could not look at Jonah. He found her there, clutching her small bag as though it held all the dignity left in her life. He did not reach for her arm, did not block her way. Instead he said, steady as the earth beneath them, you leave now, you'll be letting their shame ride your back forever. Don't you think you've carried enough already? The words struck deep. She dropped the bundle and wept, leaning against the doorframe as if her knees had given out. Jonah lifted her gently inside, no more force than the touch of rain against glass. Then came the night of reckoning. A storm rolled across the prairie with a roar, lightning splitting the sky in white veins. Thunder shook the barn walls. Clara doubled over, a cry escaping her lips. Labor had seized her early. Panic flared in Jonah, who had never faced such a thing. He gathered rags, boiled water, did what he could with trembling hands. She clutched his arm, her face pale with agony, sweat running in rivulets. Her voice broke. I can't. Yes, you can, Jonah urged, kneeling beside her, his voice fierce and low. You're stronger than you reckon. Don't you quit on me now. The hours stretched like centuries. Rain hammered the roof. Wind howled through the cracks. Jonah stayed by her side, wiping her brow, offering his hand though she gripped it until his bones ached. And then, at last, a cry rose above the storm. A baby's cry, thin and sharp, slicing through the night. Jonah held the newborn girl in his arms, his rough palms shaking as though they had been given fire. The child's breath was warm, her skin so small it seemed unreal. Something broke open inside him, then, something that had been closed since the day he laid his brother in the ground. He placed the child in Clara's arms, his voice hushed with awe. She's here. She's yours. The morning after, the town buzzed. Martha Gaines's sharp tongue wagged. Born under his roof, you hear? Mark my words, trouble come of it. But where scorn had reigned, awe began to seep in. Women who had once turned away now came with cloths, jars of milk, whispered bits of advice. Not kindness yet, not fully, but a softening at the edges. Clara felt it too. She sat in the rocking chair Jonah had dug out of the attic, holding her baby against her chest. The shame that once bent her shoulders seemed lighter. Not because the town had changed, but because Jonah had not wavered when the storm tested them both. Still, gossip lingered. At the churchyard one Sunday, a man named Ezekiel Boyd spat on the ground, near Jonah's boots. That child ain't yours, Calhoun, he sneered loud enough for all to hear. Ain't no shame in callin' a stray what it is. Jonah, who had long been silent in the face of men's talk, finally raised his voice. It wasn't loud, but it carried like iron striking stone. Blood don't make kin. Loyalty does. And I'll fight any man says otherwise. The words rang across the yard. The crowd fell still. Ezekiel looked away first, his mouth curling shut like a beaten cur. Clara, standing at the church steps, felt her breath catch. For the first time since her husband's death, she lifted her chin without fear. She was no beggar, no stray. She was chosen. That evening, the lantern glowed soft in the ranch house. Jonah rocked the baby slow, humming tunelessly, his weathered face gentled by the firelight. Clara stood in the doorway, tears glimmering, not from sorrow but from a quiet, aching gratitude. Home had come to her not in the shape she dreamed, but in the shape she needed. And the old soul's voice rose at the edge of memory, as though telling the tale to a friend by the fire. Love don't always thunder down from the heavens. Sometimes it comes quiet, like a stranger in the hay, like a hand held through the storm. And if you're lucky, you'll find someone who sees the part of you the world tried to throw away. Hold on to that, friend. That's the kind of love worth waiting years for.